Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." I speak to you today in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. The miracle of feeding the 5,000, plus women and children. Who fed all those people? All right, I'm looking at you who are here. Who fed all those people? The disciples. Thank you very much. Yes, there are so many ways we could go here today. So many. This and Jesus' resurrection are the only two miracles that are in all four Gospels, which means this feeding of the multitude is extremely important. In Matthew and Mark, there is an additional feeding, a feeding of 4,000 in addition to the feeding of the 5,000. But I don't think we ever read about it on our Sunday gospel selections, which means for some, this may be the first time that you've ever heard that there's a feeding of a 4,000 as well. The numerology and the geography of both these episodes are telling in that the feeding of the 4,000 takes place in a Gentile region, and the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in a Jewish region. Couple the geography with the numbers, and we just might have a statement that we need to hear. You see, the 7 loaves of bread in the feeding of the 4,000 harken back to perfection. 7 is the perfect number. It's the days of creation, the 7 days, and it was very good. And it symbolizes the universality of Jesus and his message and what he has to offer. It's there for everyone. The 5 loaves of bread in the feeding of the 5,000 harken back to the 5 books of Moses, the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the 12 baskets of the leftover bread should bring to mind the 12 tribes of Israel. And that desert place, that wilderness where they are, the feeding in the wilderness and the giving of the law and the instruction should make us all remember something else that happened in a wilderness. Moses, the Exodus, manna from heaven, quail, water from a rock. It should all be flowing back to any good Jew. Clearly, this feeding of the 5,000 is emphasizing Jesus and his ministry with God's chosen people, the Jewish people. And while the Gospel of John has the emphasis of Jesus being the bread of life for everybody, more than just physical bread, but something spiritual. And the reality is that all the Gospels point to Jesus as the Eucharistic feast. And with all that going on in today's gospel, today I only want to look at this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 as a pattern for discipleship. You feed them, Jesus said. First of all, it's always important to look at the context. And if we look into Matthew's gospel, if we look back to the beginning of chapter 14, this is kind of in the middle, what we hear is kind of a flashback story of King Herod beheading John the Baptist at some sort of drunken den of debauchery, masquerading as a birthday party for Herod. In Matthew's gospel, the last time we heard of John the Baptist was way back in chapter 11, and he was alive. He was in prison, but he was alive. Remember, he sent word by one of his disciples asking Jesus, "Are you the one? Are you the Messiah?" And that was the last time we heard of John until now. Now in chapter 14, Herod is hearing about Jesus and all that he is doing, and the miracles and the wonders and the healings, and he's making a commotion, and Herod is taking note. Last time he took note, it was of John the Baptist. And he thinks, is this John the Baptist who's come back to life? Wait a minute. In Matthew's gospel, he was still alive. How did he get dead? The explanation is this odd little story at the beginning of chapter 14 that explains John's death, what happened, how it happened. And at the very end, the very last sentence, it says, "And John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. And then they went and told Jesus." So now Jesus has the news. Now Jesus knows that John is dead. And that brings us to where we are, chapter 13. Not verse 13, chapter 14, and the feeding of the 5,000. But our pericope leaves off 5 words, the first 5 words of verse 13. So I'm going to tell you what those words are. Now, when Jesus heard this, what did Jesus hear? He heard that John was dead. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Well, that explains everything. That explains why he's trying to get away. He is distraught. His friend, his cousin, is dead. A gruesome death. And he needs to process it. He needs to get away. He's going to a deserted place. No doubt he will pray. Just like when his friend Lazarus died, I bet he is distraught. And so when he heard the news, he withdrew from the crowds. He got in the boat and went to that deserted place, trying to escape the ever-pressing crowds. When he got to what he had hoped to be that deserted place, a place where he could mourn his friend, pray to God, he was confronted once again by the crowds, pressing in on him. And what did Jesus do? He had compassion on them. He heals their sick. He teaches them. He interacts with them. He does what Jesus does time and time again. Just imagine one man, 12 disciples, and probably an entourage, and 5,000 men, plus women and children. It must have been a scene of chaos, with all the people trying to get a piece of Jesus, pushing in, wanting to touch him, wanting to hear what he had to say. And after being out in that wilderness all day, no doubt their physical bodies were worn out and hungry. So that's the setup. Remember earlier I said what I wanted to preach on was this feeding of the 5,000 as a pattern of discipleship. We hadn't gotten there yet. But here's the cool thing, I think. The disciples actually recognize the situation they're in. You see, they've been with Jesus long enough and they're learning. They know what's important to Jesus. They knew that the people were hungry. And they knew how far they were from towns and cities. And they knew that they didn't have anything. But they needed to be fed. You see, they were starting to get it. They at least knew what needed to be done and what was important to Jesus. These people needed a solution. So the disciples said, send them away. Send them back to their towns. And Jesus looks at them. You don't need to send them away. You feed them. And the disciples' reaction is what ours would have been, I guarantee you. It's a heavy dose of realism. I wouldn't even call them excuses. I would call them realism. Steeped in this world, the disciples tell Jesus the realities confronting them. They're in the middle of nowhere, at least a day's journey from any of these towns or cities. They have no food to speak of. Even if they were close enough to a city, they didn't have enough money to go buy enough food for this many. All we have are 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus says, great, that's enough. Bring them to me. And they brought them to him, and he sat them down on the grass. And Jesus took the bread, and he broke it. And he looked up to heaven, and he blessed. And then he gave it to the disciples to give to the people. Think about this. 12 disciples and thousands of people to be fed. I wonder how many times the disciples had to come back to Jesus and get more and more and more, and then carry it back out to the people who were hungry. I imagine that it took hours, and all the while Jesus just kept breaking the bread, giving it to the disciples, and the disciples kept distributing it. There was more than enough for everyone. So maybe this is that pattern of discipleship that I was speaking of. The disciples know what's important to Jesus and bring the needs to Jesus. The disciples, steeped in the world, give all sorts of worldly solutions, like send them away, send them to the village. We can't feed them. We have no money. We have no scarcity. And Jesus says, no, you have a great idea. Feed them. They're hungry. We need to eat. You do it. And Jesus takes what seems like meager resources, the things that we think are nothing. He offers it up to God. He blesses it and breaks it open and gives it back to his disciples. The people are fed, not in the way the disciples could have ever imagined or envisioned, but better. I think of St. Mary's and I think of a similar miracle. We look out on the street, there's a symbol of that, and we see it every day. The St. Mary's Little Free Pantry is a great example of this. The disciples, the folks here at St. Mary's, thought that the church school needed a hands-on project. That was our goal. Someone saw somewhere on the internet something similar. I think it was called a blessing box. But the idea was to have some sort of 24/7 food pantry out on the front lawn. It's not very big, not a lot of food. The idea was brought in front of the vestry, and we had a lot of worldly questions that we needed to answer before we could implement it. What's the liability, they asked. How will the food do in the heat and the cold? It's in a box. Will the weather ruin it? Where will the food come from? What if someone takes all the food? You mean you're going to trust them with that? What if the box is vandalized or destroyed or whatever? Where will it go on the property? What's the best place? Will it be an eyesore? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to maintain it? On and on these worldly questions came. And they're all good questions, so we need to consider these things. All great, but by the end of the day, we offered it up to Jesus. And Jesus blessed it. He broke it open. He gave it to us to do. He said, you do it. And there have been so many miracles associated with this little free pantry. A little food cupboard the size of a refrigerator sitting out on our front lawn. Those of you who are associated with St. Mary's, you remember George Arnott. He was able to throw himself into the project as a tribute to Mary Jo, who had just died. It's probably the first miracle of the process. Fred Lohman was able to work with his friend George, not knowing that it would be the last project that he would accomplish with George. And look at it. The two of them were able to teach, mentor, and disciple kids and see how to build such a thing. Ask them questions, getting them thinking. I think George had it all planned out in their head, but he led them in such a way that it sounded like the kids decided everything. And then they started gathering the food. And it was put out there, and we blessed it as a community. At first, I think the public was a bit weary. What is this? What do you mean we can come anytime and take whatever food we need? That's not the way the world works. But eventually, the people started trusting us There was not an ulterior motive. The little free pantry would empty out weekly, and people would only take what they needed. 3 diapers rather than the whole pack. A few packets of ramen noodles rather than the whole big bunch of it. There is one man who I see almost every day who comes and gets 1 can of food, and then he goes over there to the middle school, and he sits on the wall, and he eats it, throws it away, and goes about his business. Now, during the pandemic, the little free pantry is emptied almost every day, sometimes twice a day. But I see just as many people adding food to it each and every day. People who we didn't expect, people who aren't what we consider St. Mary's, neighbors, scouts, people who've taken food and want to give back. Who could have ever imagined the success that this little box is having? Jesus. Jesus could. Not us, who are so steeped in the world, but as faithful disciples, it's okay for us not to have the whole big plan, to let Jesus figure it out, to just be faithful. Now we're going to try something new. This idea came out of a parish Zoom meeting last Thursday. Are you ready for this? Many of you haven't heard it yet. But here it is. I may be announcing it earlier than it needs to, but here I'm going to do it anyway. This summer, as a lot of us have gardens and vegetables, what if we brought our extras to the church? We could put them out by the little free pantry, not in a box where it heats up, but on a table underneath a tent. And we could have fresh vegetables as well as canned food. We could set up that tent. What if somebody were out there with it from time to time, meeting the neighbors, meeting hungry people, saying, hey, do you need this? Do you want that? Do you have any prayer requests? Greeting both our neighbors and hungry people. We could bring everything in the evenings, so it's not out in the elements. I wonder what would happen if we tried this. Do you think our neighbors would bring their vegetables too? Or would it just be us? Maybe a grocery store would give us some excess. You never know unless you ask. What do you think? I don't know her name, but the lady who brings us bread from time to time when she's collecting excess bread from the bakery. I see her once or twice a week. What if she came and put some bread out there too? Do you think we could do this once a week or twice a week or 3 times a week? I wonder if we could pull this off. Are some of you looking for something to do during a pandemic? I bet the ideas are already germinating in your brain even as we speak. The what ifs. What could we do? What could happen? What could Jesus do with this? What if we did bring that idea to Jesus? How much do you want to bet that he blesses it, breaks it open, and gives it back to us and says, you do it, but in a way that we never could have imagined? Everything that I just said, what if we don't do it that way? It's done some other way. I wonder. Discipleship. It's a crazy thing. It's our idea, or at least we see the needs when we're thinking like Jesus. But it's Jesus doing the work, doing the impossible, getting rid of all our worldly objections, getting rid of our realistic viewpoints. And it's Jesus at work through your hands and your feet and your mouths as disciples. He's going to give it back to you to implement. You do it, he says. And we say yes.